In 1990, the average American home cost around $150,000. By 2000, it was just over $200,000. By 2010, $280,000. Today, well over $420,000. In just 3 decades, home prices have more than tripled. And as of November 2025, the United States is in what many economists call full-blown housing crisis. Prices are at record highs. Construction costs keep climbing. Builders can't keep up. And it's not just the land, it's not just demand, and it's not just interest rates. There's something else, something hidden inside the walls. Because buried in the frame of almost every American home is a material that comes overwhelmingly from one place: Canada. Not because Canada is restricting it, not because Canada is causing the crisis, but because for reasons most people have never heard, the United States grew deeply dependent on this one source. Take that supply away overnight, and American home building wouldn't just slow down, it would be thrown into chaos. So how did the United States, a country with enormous land, resources, and its own building industry, become so dependent on a single neighbor? The answer has nothing to do with trade policy, corporate decisions, or political disputes. The real answer goes much deeper. This is why the US can't build homes without Canada. Let's start with what's actually inside those walls. Lumber, specifically softwood lumber, the 2x4s, 2x6s, plywood, and framing materials that form the skeleton of American houses. We don't think about them because we never see them. Real estate listings talk about granite countertops, walk-in closets, double garages. Nobody says, this house has 35 cubic meters of SPF framing lumber sourced from British Columbia. But without that lumber, there is no house. The average American single-family home uses about 16,000 board feet of lumber. That's the equivalent of dozens of mature trees worth of wood. The United States builds about 1.4 million new homes per year. That's 22 billion board feet of lumber annually, just for residential construction. Add in commercial buildings, renovations, and other construction, and you're looking at around 50 billion board feet of lumber consumed in the US every year. And here's the number that changes everything. About 30% of all that lumber comes from Canada. In some regions, particularly the western states, Canadian SPF shows up everywhere. That's not a small dependency. That's a structural reliance on a foreign supply chain for one of the most basic building materials in existence. But here's what makes this really strange. The United States has plenty of forests, about 750 million acres of forest land covering roughly 1/3 of the country. So why can't America supply its own lumber? The answer starts with understanding that not all wood is created equal. For home construction, you need softwood lumber: pine, spruce, fir, hemlock. These trees grow straight and tall, are easy to cut and shape, and have the strength-to-weight ratio perfect for framing. Hardwoods like oak and maple are too dense and expensive for framing. They're great for furniture and flooring, but you can't build an entire house frame from them economically. So when Americans build homes, they need softwood. Lots of it. And here's where geography enters the picture. The best softwood lumber comes from specific types of forests in specific climates. And Canada has something the United States largely doesn't: the boreal forest. The boreal forest is a massive band of coniferous trees stretching across Canada from coast to coast. From Yukon and the Northwest Territories in the west, through British Columbia's northern interior, across Alberta's Peace River country, through Saskatchewan and Manitoba, into Ontario's Clay Belt, through Quebec's Abitibi region, and all the way to Labrador and Newfoundland in the east. It's one of the largest intact forest ecosystems on Earth, covering about 1.4 billion acres. Towns like Prince George in British Columbia, Grande Prairie in Alberta, the Pas in Manitoba, Hearst and Kapuskasing in Ontario, Val-d'Or and Chibougamau in Quebec. These are mill towns built entirely around harvesting the boreal forest. These northern forests produce trees with unique characteristics. They grow slowly because of the cold climate. Slow growth means tighter growth rings. Tighter rings mean stronger, more stable wood. The wood is less prone to warping and twisting. This makes Canadian lumber ideal for construction. Now compare that to American softwood forests. The United States has two main softwood regions: the Pacific Northwest, the coastal forests of Washington and Oregon, from Bellingham down through Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and Eugene, the Cascade Range, the Olympic Peninsula, Northern California's redwood country around Eureka and Crescent City. These forests produce excellent Douglas fir and hemlock. Towns like Longview, Washington, and Roseburg, Oregon built their entire economies around timber. But here's the problem. Much of this forest is now protected. National forests, wilderness areas, spotted owl habitat. The timber that built America in the 20th century is largely off limits in the 21st. Then there's the Southeast, the Pine Belt stretching from East Texas through Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Places like Bogalusa, Louisiana, Crosset, Arkansas, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. These are pine plantation towns where loblolly and slash pine grow fast in the humid subtropical climate. But that's exactly the problem. They grow too fast. The warm climate and long growing season create wood that's softer, less dense, and more prone to warping than northern lumber. So the United States has forests, but they're either in the wrong climate zone or they're protected from harvesting. Meanwhile, Canada's boreal forest stretches unbroken for thousands of miles at exactly the right latitude, between 50 degrees and 60 degrees north, where the cold climate creates the slow-growing, tight-grained lumber that builders want. Climate and latitude created this. Not policy, not economics, geography. So the United States has softwood forests in the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast. But having forests and being able to use them are two very different things. And this is where American geography creates problems that Canadian geography doesn't have. Problem 1, ownership. Remember those mill towns we talked about? Prince George, Grande Prairie, Val d'Or. They exist because the forests around them are crown land, owned by provincial governments. About 90% of Canadian forests are publicly owned. Timber companies don't own the land. They get licenses from provincial governments to harvest it. This creates predictable, stable supply. The government sets harvest levels based on sustainable yield. Companies know how much they can cut. Markets know how much supply to expect. In the United States, it's the opposite. Roughly 58% of US forest land is privately owned, including both family and corporate timberland, while about 42% is public, split between federal, state, and local governments. Private landowners harvest timber when it's profitable for them, not when the market needs it. If lumber prices drop, they hold timber off the market. If prices spike, they flood the market. This creates supply volatility that makes long-term planning nearly impossible. Corporate timberland owners are even worse. They're focused on maximizing shareholder returns quarter by quarter. They'll clear cut when prices are high and sit idle when prices are low. Geography determined these ownership patterns. Canada's forests were largely unsettled when provinces formed, so they remained crown land. America's forests were settled earlier, divided up, and sold off to private interests. Problem 2, what you can't touch. The best American softwood, that Douglas fir in Washington and Oregon, sits largely on federal land. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the Mount Hood National Forest, the Willamette National Forest. These are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and environmental regulations severely limit what can be harvested. The northern spotted owl listing in 1990 cut timber harvests from federal lands in the Pacific Northwest by over 80% almost overnight. Towns like Forks, Washington went from 3,000 jobs in timber to a few hundred. Mill towns across Oregon and Washington collapsed. Today, federal lands that could theoretically supply massive amounts of lumber are largely off limits. Meanwhile, in Canada, even though forests are publicly owned, they're managed for sustainable harvest. Environmental protections exist, but they're balanced with economic use. The result? Canadian mills have consistent access to timber. American mills don't. Problem 3, distance. Here's a map problem that geography makes impossible to solve. American softwood forests are in two places: the Pacific Northwest corner and the Southeast corner. But American construction happens everywhere: Phoenix, Denver, Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta, Boston. Getting lumber from Longview, Washington to Dallas, Texas is 2,000 miles. From Hattiesburg, Mississippi to Denver, Colorado is 1,300 miles. Every mile adds cost: trucking, rail, fuel, time. Now look at Canada's boreal forest. It stretches coast to coast, relatively close to the US border. Mills in British Columbia ship to California, Washington, and Oregon. Mills in Alberta and Saskatchewan supply Montana, North Dakota, and the upper Midwest. Mills in Ontario and Quebec serve the Great Lakes region and the Northeast. The average distance from a Canadian mill to a US market is often shorter than from an American mill to that same market. Geography gave Canada a distribution advantage that the United States simply doesn't have. Problem 4. The mills that aren't there anymore. In the late 20th century, North America had well over 1,000 softwood sawmills. Since then, consolidation, closures, and changing policies have wiped out a huge share of that capacity, especially in US mill towns. Why? Because American mills face costs that Canadian mills don't. Higher labor costs, stricter environmental compliance, volatile energy prices, uncertain timber supply from private landowners. Meanwhile, Canada maintained and even expanded mill capacity. Canadian mills are often larger, more modern, and more efficient. They have stable timber supply from Crown land. They have lower energy costs. They have government support for capital investment. Towns like Prince George have state-of-the-art mills processing millions of board feet per year. American mill towns? Many are ghost towns now. So even if the United States suddenly had unlimited access to timber, it doesn't have the mill capacity to process it all anymore. The infrastructure has been dismantled. The expertise has left. The towns have emptied out. Geography created these constraints: ownership patterns, forest distribution, distance to markets. And once those constraints triggered mill closures, they became self-reinforcing. Fewer mills mean less demand for timber. Less demand means more private landowners hold timber off the market. Less supply means higher prices. Higher prices make Canadian imports more attractive. Canadian imports undercut the remaining American mills. More mills close. Geography set this cycle in motion, and it's not easy to reverse. So here's where the United States finds itself today. About 30% of all softwood lumber consumed in America comes from Canada. In some markets, particularly the western states, California, Arizona, Nevada, Canadian lumber supplies a huge share of the framing market, especially compared with other foreign imports. These states are closer to Canadian mills in British Columbia than to American mills in the Southeast. This dependency has created a bizarre economic and political situation, because American lumber producers hate Canadian competition. They argue that Canada's system of Crown land and government-set stumpage fees amounts to an unfair subsidy. Canadian lumber companies pay the government for cutting rights, but American producers claim those fees are artificially low. This has led to decades of trade disputes. The United States has imposed tariffs on Canadian lumber multiple times: in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, 2017, and again in October 14, 2025. Most recently, in October 2025, tariffs jumped to 35.2%, more than double the previous 14.54%. 10% of the total new tariff specifically targets softwood timber, logs, and lumber. But here's the problem: the tariffs don't work. When the US imposes tariffs on Canadian lumber, Canadian imports drop slightly, but American production doesn't increase enough to fill the gap. Why? Because of all those geographic and structural problems we just talked about. American mills can't just magically produce more lumber. Remember, you can't relocate the boreal forest. You can't change where the best timber grows. You can't rebuild 800 closed sawmills overnight. Geography created this dependency, and tariffs can't change geography. So what actually happens is lumber prices spike. In 2021, lumber prices hit record highs, over $1,600 per thousand board feet. Normally, lumber trades around $300 to $400. This added about $36,000 to the cost of building an average new home. Home builders screamed. Consumers couldn't afford houses. The housing crisis got worse, and the United States quietly kept importing Canadian lumber because there was no alternative. This is the dependency trap. Even with lumber prices settling to $546.50 per thousand board feet in 2025, still 35 to 80% above historical norms, the damage is done. America still needs Canadian lumber, but American producers demand protection from Canadian competition. The result is higher prices for everyone and no real solution. And it directly feeds into those home prices we talked about at the beginning. $150,000 in 1990, over $420,000 today. Lumber isn't the only reason home prices exploded, but when framing costs jump by tens of thousands of dollars overnight, it amplifies an already brutal housing market. But there's a new factor that's making this situation even more complicated: climate change. And it's affecting both Canadian and American forests in ways that could reshape the entire lumber industry. In Canada, the mountain pine beetle. Climate change has allowed the mountain pine beetle to spread across British Columbia and into Alberta. Warmer winters mean the beetles don't die off like they used to. These beetles have killed over half of British Columbia's merchantable pine. The devastation is staggering. In British Columbia alone, the beetle has killed trees across more than 18 million hectares. That's 44 million acres, an area larger than the entire state of Washington. The Interior Plateau, the Caribou region, the forests around Prince George, one of those mill towns we talked about, have been decimated. By 2017, around 55 to 60% of the merchantable pine in British Columbia was dead or dying. Dead trees can still be harvested for a few years, but eventually they rot and become unusable. This has created a temporary surge in Canadian lumber production as mills race to harvest dead trees. But once those dead trees are gone, there will be a massive supply gap, which is the terrifying part because it takes 60 to 80 years to grow a new harvestable tree. In the United States, wildfires. The Western United States is experiencing unprecedented wildfire seasons. Millions of acres of forest are burning every year. In 2020, California lost 4.3 million acres to fire, including prime timber country in the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Ranges. The Dixie Fire in 2021 burned nearly 1 million acres across Plumas and Butte counties, traditional logging territory. Oregon's 2020 Labor Day fires destroyed timber worth billions of dollars in the Cascade foothills. And it's getting worse. The 2023 wildfire season burned about 2.6 to 3.1 million acres nationwide. This destroys timber before it can be harvested and makes forest management even more complicated and expensive. But here's the deeper problem. These fires are burning so hot that they're sterilizing the soil. In some areas, forests aren't regenerating at all. Both countries, changing growth patterns. Climate change is shifting where trees grow and how fast they grow. Some regions are becoming too hot and dry for traditional softwood species. Others are seeing faster growth, but lower quality wood. The geographic advantages that made Canadian lumber superior might be changing. And here's the really scary scenario. What if both Canadian and American lumber production declined simultaneously? The United States would be competing with the rest of the world for a shrinking supply of lumber. Prices would explode. Home construction would collapse. This isn't hypothetical. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we got a preview of what this looks like. Supply chain disruptions, mill shutdowns, and surging demand sent lumber prices to record highs. Home construction slowed. Renovation projects were delayed. The housing crisis intensified. And that was temporary. Climate change is permanent. The geographic foundation that created this dependency is shifting beneath our feet. So what does the future of American home construction look like? Right now, the United States is caught between three bad options. Option 1, Accept permanent dependence on Canada. This means dropping tariffs, accepting Canadian lumber as essential, and building the housing market around continued imports. American lumber producers hate this, but it's the economic reality. The United States simply cannot produce enough lumber domestically to meet demand. Geography, regulations, and mill capacity make it impossible. Option 2, massively expand domestic production. This would require opening more federal land to logging, politically difficult, building dozens of new sawmills, expensive and time-consuming, changing environmental regulations, politically toxic, accepting higher lumber prices during the transition, economically painful. Even if all of this happened, it would take 10 to 20 years to significantly increase domestic production. And you still can't change the fundamental geography. American forests don't produce the same quality lumber as the Canadian boreal forest. The climate is different. The growth patterns are different. You can increase supply, but you can't replicate what geography created in Canada. Option 3, find alternatives to wood. This is already happening. Steel framing, concrete construction, engineered wood products, and modular building techniques are all reducing lumber demand. But wood is still the cheapest and most practical material for most residential construction. Alternatives are more expensive and require different skills and equipment. A steel-framed house can cost 15 to 20% more than a wood-framed house. Concrete construction is even more expensive. For a country already struggling with housing affordability, making homes more expensive isn't a solution. The most likely scenario is a combination of all three. The United States will continue importing Canadian lumber because there's no choice. It will slowly expand domestic production where possible, and it will gradually shift to alternative building materials. But in the short to medium term, the next 10 to 20 years, American home construction will remain dependent on Canadian lumber. And that dependency is actually increasing, not decreasing. As American forests face climate challenges, as environmental regulations tighten, and as mill capacity continues to decline, Canadian lumber becomes even more critical. There's also a geopolitical angle here that's worth considering. Canada is a stable, friendly neighbor with a reliable supply chain. The border is peaceful. Trade flows smoothly despite occasional disputes. Imagine if the United States was this dependent on lumber from China, Russia, or Brazil. The strategic vulnerability would be enormous. The Canada-US lumber relationship, despite the trade disputes, is actually one of the most stable resource dependencies in the world. But it's still a dependency, and dependencies create vulnerabilities. So let's come back to where we started. 1990, $123,000 for an average home. 2024, over $420,000. That's more than a tripling in price. And hidden inside that increase is the cost of lumber, a material that America increasingly cannot produce enough of on its own. The housing crisis isn't just about land scarcity or interest rates or demand. It's about the fundamental materials needed to build homes. And one of the most important of those materials comes from across the border. This isn't about trade policy or corporate decisions or political disputes. It's about geography. Canada has the boreal forest, 1.4 billion acres at 50 to 60 degrees north latitude, where cold climate creates slow growth and tight grain. Canada has public ownership, 90% crown land creating stable supply. Canada has mill capacity, maintained and expanded while America closed 800 mills. Canada has distribution, coast-to-coast forests close to the US border. Meanwhile, the United States has private ownership creating supply volatility, protected federal forest off-limits to harvest, 800 closed mills, and forests concentrated in two corners, Pacific Northwest and Southeast, far from most construction. The United States could theoretically become self-sufficient in lumber, but it would require massive changes to land use policy, environmental regulations, and industrial capacity, and it would take decades. In the meantime, every time an American family buys a new home, there's a good chance the frame holding it up came from a tree that grew in a Canadian forest. The 2x4s in the walls, the plywood in the floors, the roof trusses overhead, Canadian wood holding up the American dream. It's one of the most important economic relationships between the two countries, and most Americans have no idea it exists. Geography made Canada the lumber supplier to America, and geography ensures that relationship will continue. Because in the end, you can't change where the best trees grow. You can't relocate forests, and you can't build homes without wood. As home prices continue to climb, $500,000, $600,000, maybe higher, that hidden dependency will only become more critical. The housing crisis won't be solved without addressing the lumber supply, and the lumber supply can't be addressed without Canada. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should the US invest in becoming lumber independent, or is Canadian lumber dependency just the geographic reality we have to accept? If this changed how you see the hidden connections between housing costs and geography, hit the like button and subscribe, because we have very interesting stories coming your way.